Welcome everyone to the String and Splinter and to Southwest, Inner City Southwest High Point. This is one of our restored mills, and this was the offices of Tomlinson Chair, as you all know. That was built between 1902 and 1927. But we are so pleased to have everyone here today, and also to welcome back Dover Cole and Partners, who's been collaborating with the Southwest Renewal Foundation and the City of High Point, Piedmont Tribe Regional Council, a big collaboration and partnerships, and they'll be talking about the progress we're making in the inner city Southwest quadrant. Frank, we would like for Frank to come, Frank Thomas, who you all well know, a leader here in High Point, to come up and give a short convocation.
Invocation.
Excuse me, invocation. Thank you.
Convocations are not short.
I knew I would mess up, but here it is. Yeah, you're exactly right.
As we prepare to pray, I'm just asking if you haven't already thought about and said a special prayer for our neighbors in the western part of the state. They have been devastated, and I'm just blessed to be here because my wife and I were actually planning a trip to the mountains this weekend. And Friday we saw the signs that said, "Do not travel to Western North Carolina. I-40 closed past Statesville." I'm so glad we weren't there and could get back. But just remember them. Lives lost, families and homes devastated, businesses, churches, you name it. We're already, an organization I'm a part of, we're already planning some relief efforts, but we just don't know yet. So just say a prayer for them. As we talk today about renewal, let's not forget those who are less fortunate than us. Lord, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this gathering. We pray that you would continue to bless and watch over our neighbors in the western part of the state and all those affected by Hurricane Helene. And we thank you today for this gathering and all that will take place. We pray that it will be to your glory and ultimately give you honor. Bless us. The food that's been prepared, let it nourish our bodies so we can continue to serve you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Reverend Frank. And now we have our famous City Council representative for Inner City Southwest High Point, Ward 3, Monica Peters.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. And thank you, Reverend Thomas. That was beautiful. And thank you all for being here. I'm so excited. So yes, I'm the representative for Ward 3. And I know that a lot of people have noticed in the last several years all the fantastic growth going on in High Point. And we're so thrilled for that. And now we're really super thrilled for the Southwest. I've always had passion for the historic industrial corridors, and I just love what's getting ready to happen next. So I'm so thankful for you all to be here. I also would like to recognize a few of our city officials. We've got Councilwoman Amanda Cook. Thank you for being here. Councilwoman Vicki McKeever. And then we have our County Commissioner at Large, Kay Cashin. Thank you so much. And we've got lots of city staff and management and planning and transportation. So on behalf of the City of High Point, we thank you for being here. And now we are so pleased to introduce the fabulous Dover Cole and to see their presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for having us here today. It's wonderful to be back in High Point, and we're grateful for the opportunity to continue to partner with you all as residents, property owners, local leaders, city staff, city officials. So thank you for the opportunity. My name is Margaret Flippen, and I am a senior planner with Dover Cole and Partners. We are a town planning and urban design firm, and we focus on creating complete neighborhoods and livable communities and reclaiming that lost space as we're looking at redevelopment and revitalization. So what I thought I'd do today to start off was just sort of showcasing some highlights of Southwest High Point and some investment that's currently going on, whether on the public side or the private side as well, and look at some incredible opportunities with regards to the Heritage Greenway and opportunities there. So when we were here just about, I guess it's almost been a year ago, well, it's been a little over a year, February of 2023, we had the opportunity to take a deep dive and look at Southwest High Point. And so with Dorothy and the Southwest Renewal Foundation, the opportunity to look at the various areas, each distinct character with a long history, with the close proximity to downtown, as well as the industry and manufacturing, as well as the residential components in the area as well. So this was sort of looking at the Southwest from the 300 Oak, which the city has recently invested in with the Green Incubator Business District, to the Mill District along the rail line, which is sort of the economic reason for being has changed over time, but yet you have this incredible building stock. And then the South Side neighborhood around Fairview Elementary and the Recreation Center. And then South Main Street, looking at linkages to GTCC and how to sort of improve those connections. So helping to sort of build the whole neighborhood up with access to jobs, education, and just general livability in the area. So many of you all, a lot of familiar faces today. It's wonderful to see you all again. Like I said, we're grateful to be welcome back. But this was sort of the process that we did, whereas we were walking around, driving around, taking a real thorough look at Southwest and looking at the opportunities, some incredible structures and some incredible opportunities to build more complete, and especially as the industry has changed slightly, to sort of build on the long legacy in High Point, but also be able to add to that as well. The South Side neighborhood, looking at opportunities for additional housing opportunities and basically looking at ways with the long legacy and history in the neighborhood, but to maintain that residential character and to help the existing residents and community development initiatives that are ongoing in the city and with previous planning efforts as well. But really taking a look at what has been going on with regards to a lot of adaptive reuse of buildings and how to sort of continue that momentum and continue that energy. We set up at Pandora's, where we were actually working on site, sort of starting to sketch some designs and ideas. And that was a really fantastic process. We were able to have a lot of solid community conversations and just sort of get that input to move forward. So as we did that, and as we were coming up with these different designs and scenarios, we created a document called the Blueprints. And what the Blueprints is it's sort of guidelines and recommendations for moving forward and moving forward together. And so what I was going to do is just sort of show you all some of the ideas and some of the recommendations. And so this, I think, is a really great example. This was something that we looked at in February of 2023, where a small building can have a big impact. And we talked a lot about when a pebble drops into water and the ripple effect from that. And so this is really exciting at 520 West Green and the opportunities that have come along with this property. So looking at how a building with the structure can have a variety of uses over time, and so how that building can be refurbished and rehabilitated for new uses. So this is a very exciting process, an exciting project that Ritvan has been leading, and we're excited to say that it's opening soon. Is that correct for market? So a great opportunity and a great, it was really a wonderful process to be able to start to draw some ideas and then to have someone who's ready to give back to the city and make this building more complete. So very exciting with Steinway coming in. 300 Oak with the city investment of the Green Incubator District, and also looking at the Greenway. And one thing with looking at 300 Oak and with the Greenway, which the Southwest Renewal Foundation has been very helpful in leading, is the strategic infill and looking at how over time the properties can become more complete. And this is incremental development, so it doesn't happen overnight, but it happens over time. But by having a plan in place, you can understand how to sort of build those spaces more complete. And also this shows an example of a mix of uses, to be able to have a mix of housing types and a mix of uses. How buildings confront the Greenway, and how to build a more complete green avenue. And then once again, the Greenway coming in with additional development and opportunities to front that space. So other components, looking at walkable streets, and this is on West Green and Grimes. The Mill Environs area, incredible buildings, incredible opportunities. And with the Greenway, opportunities to encourage development and redevelopment along this essential green corridor. This was a rendering that my colleague Robin Crowder created. This is sort of over by the Myrtle Desk building, and the opportunity of having the Greenway going through. So we looked at the Belt Line, we looked at the High Line in New York, just different opportunities of successful greenways throughout our country and what that could be for Southwest High Point as well. The Southside neighborhood, looking at how vacant land can be cultivated to build back a more vibrant neighborhood fabric. And so this was, you all have an incredible resource in your geographic information systems at the city of High Point. And so we were able to look back at the aerial photographs from 1958. And it's really interesting looking at the building pattern with the blocks and the streets and the houses set up facing the streets, and then over time with the unfortunate circumstances of urban renewal, what that did to the neighborhood. So 1958 to 2022. So you can see where the neighborhood fabric was very much eroded over the past decades, and how to sort of build back and sort of take some of that land and reclaim some of those lost spaces and build back that connected fabric of neighborhood. So one example we were looking at was this parcel, which is along South Main and Elm in Vale, I believe, Vale also, and sort of what that could look like as far as restitching that urban fabric of neighborhood. And so the yellow circle, you can see where we took that city block or that city parcel and looking at how you could have a mix of infill development and a mix of housing types and buildings. And so looking at, through the blueprints, more options for the South Side. Understanding that the blueprints is not necessarily a full-blown plan for the South Side neighborhood, but more of just some options and recommendations that build off of the existing plan for South Side that was done by the city. And this is a really great angle to look at. So this is that same parcel, currently open space, open land right along South Main and South Main and South Elm. And what that would look like with having a new mix of housing types where you have more single family or multifamily residential sort of facing the neighborhood with more mix of uses facing South Main. So more intensity of uses along the bigger corridor, but in the neighborhood, some smaller scale development that would allow more housing opportunities in the area. So these are all sort of conceptual sketches just to sort of get an idea of illustrating a vision rather than just using words to describe that vision, but sort of to make sure that we're on the right track with the things that folks are looking to see in the neighborhood and in the area. And then the area around South Main Street with the community college and how to make the connection. So this is actually that same parcel, just looking at it from a different angle, creating a more walkable South Main and having street-oriented buildings facing that street as well. When we gathered February of 23, these were some things when we asked, one word that describes Southwest High Point today. Granted, this is about 1.5 years old, so hopefully some of these things are starting to change. But, just quickly asking one word that comes to mind then, and then what you would like to see in the future. And so this was really encouraging to us as we were working on creating the blueprints document, that looking at the future with a lot of hope, a lot of prosperity, and a lot of opportunity. So this is the blueprints document that many of you have seen, as well as it's on the Southwest Renewal Foundation website. It's maybe like 20 pages long, but it just sort of synthesizes some of these initial recommendations. And so what's been really fantastic about that is Dorothy and the Southwest Renewal Foundation have been able to take a lot of these drawings, all these illustrations, and apply for grants and apply for different opportunities to start working towards implementation. So whether it's West Green Drive or the Greenway, being able to put these tools to work and to be able to start to look towards implementation. So while all of that's been going on with the blueprints and with grant funding, we are super impressed with what you all have done as a city and community with your comprehensive plan. When we wrapped up in February of 23 and we knew the comp plan was coming, I had no idea how much detail and how much just sort of momentum could happen in a short amount of time. So very impressed with that document and very much honored that the Southwest is very much highlighted throughout the comprehensive plan, which has been adopted by City Council. And part of that is the Southwest was featured as an activity center, a town center. And so that's really important because this is the area around 300 Oak, and these are pages from the comprehensive plan. And they talk about that mix of uses. And so right now in Southwest High Point, a lot, especially along the rail line, has been focused on industry. But looking at, in addition to industry, with light industry and small scale manufacturing, are there opportunities to introduce additional uses to make the area more complete? Part of that you all have been working towards is sort of looking at your overall land development regulations and zoning. And so one thing that came out of the comprehensive plan was looking at the idea of a transitional industrial district, which sort of takes it still focuses on the legacy of town building and manufacturing industry, but also starts to open up the idea for additional uses and opportunities. And so what we find very exciting about that is the transitional industrial area highlighted in the comp plan is basically the Southwest District. And so I share this and I share our enthusiasm for it because it's like we're all sort of saying the same thing. It's just a matter of how we get there and how we start to make that positive change happen. So what is transitional industrial? These are just some sort of key things that are included in the comp plan that sort of helps to identify transitional industrial as allowing mixed use, reuse of existing buildings, adaptive reuse, live-work districts. And a lot of that happens in some of the historic mill villages, but the opportunity to be able to live close to work and to have that opportunity as well. Light manufacturing, because one thing that we want to make sure, especially with this industrial area, that that has been the long-time economic reason for being for High Point, and to make sure that that is maintained and preserved as well. And then looking at parks, plazas, and neighborhood serving retail to enhance the overall character and livability of the area. So primary uses are associated with transitional industrial are still the focus on live work, light industrial, and makerspace, but then it's complemented by additional uses like residential and commercial. The transportation, so it's very interesting looking at transportation and street design because you think of industrial buildings, but it's also important to have access to transit and walkability. And so there's a lot of different things that go into that, making it more complete. The existing zoning districts, so the dark purple here is heavy industrial, and the light purple that's a little bit hard to see, sort of around 630 West Green, that's light industrial. And so what we were doing as part of our analysis was looking at the existing regulations and looking at what's currently allowed in light industrial and heavy industrial, and what may be some changes looking forward in the future. So right now, where we're at in the process is we've got the concepts and the blueprints, and now looking at the opportunity for land development regulation changes and looking towards implementation. So I'd like to invite my colleague, Victor Dover. He's going to kind of give us a little bit more with regards to opportunities in mixed-use industrial.
Thanks, Margaret. She's got more later, so I'll have to do another round of applause coming up. You know, about a year and a half ago, I had a chance to talk to many of you, and I said, cities are works in progress. Remember that discussion? That they're like works of art in which many, many people are collaborating that are never finished. Some of the collaborators will never meet each other because they live in different centuries. And that's the process of city making. We inherit what we have, what was used once upon a time had this or that economic reason for being, and we repurpose it, we recycle it, we adjust it, we add to it. Sometimes we remove things and add new things back. That's the process of city making that's never finished. It's why I'm always saying planning is a verb. Can I get a nod of agreement from the city staff to that idea? We're never finished, right? But you have this great tradition already underway here of inheriting buildings and spaces and street addresses that once upon a time had one use or one purpose, and modifying them to adapt them to new uses. And it shows up in a lot of different ways. Obviously, in Congdon Yards, a phenomenal national example of that in a very big way. But also at a smaller scale, sites like Cohab have proven the ability to take a place and leverage its inherent place qualities and repurpose it to new uses, reweave in new entrepreneurs to replace the ones that were there in the past. And always coming back to what can we do in the spaces between the buildings, not just within the buildings themselves. I think that fits with the idea of craftsmanship and making things. It's always been a tradition here. But as you shift now from doing mass production of large batches of identical products to doing small batches and moving the designers and the people who are making the things they've designed closer together, and to being open to year-round customers, not just the ones a couple times a year. These are the transitions that are underway, and you have tremendous textbook really in the industrial buildings of the past that were here. We have this now growing collection of High Point books from which we learn a lot. Look at what industrial buildings once looked like. I mean, that's almost like a palace for a European principality. There was a grandeur to it, and they never neglected the space outside the building. It was meant to send a message, not just to the people who worked there or the people who were buying things from the manufacturer, but to everyone who went by, about the pride of place. Look, and you'll see examples of it, not just in the decorations or ornament of a great old building like that one on the left, but in simple things like the doors and windows facing the street and the clear indication of where the entrance is. And it's not just a building poking out of a parking lot, randomly set on its lot. So there's this kind of convergence going on between the items Margaret described in the blueprints for Southwest, the report that was done by Ilana Prus and Smart Growth America, looking at the makerspace and the future of small batches and small scale manufacturing. The recommendations in that report basically said this is the neighborhood in which to prove this idea. This is the neighborhood in which to build back small scale manufacturing. And this in particular, it says, implement the vision. Those are the most important words today. We could keep on planning till we get it absolutely, perfectly, 100% exactly textbook right. But we probably could do that from now until the end of time. So it's actually important to decide at some point we've got enough of the basic details down and need to take action. I'll show you what some other cities have done that have been doing that. If you go just a bit to the north in Richmond, you find old industrial spaces like Hull Street, the way we found it in 2005, actually. That was, I told you before, we were in the before and after business. So we started making pictures of how that place could be transformed as infill development and adaptive reuse of the historic structures took place, and even projected forward into a longer distance future in which they start to adjust their transportation around the reinvigorated, repopulated, thickened up with buildings centers in places like Hull Street in Richmond. And what do you know? Out of that bubbles up Hull Street Action, an organization that is implementing the vision and every day. I want to switch just for a minute to talk about why zoning matters so much. I know Margaret showed you some very abstract maps and long lists of land uses and so on a minute ago. Why does that stuff matter so much? Well, in the time before there were strong land development regulations, during the industrialization period, first in England and places like Manchester and Liverpool, and then in New England, and then in the Sun Belt, we implemented a whole lot of industry without much care for how it was going to affect people's public health. And it took a lot of a 100-year effort, really, sustained around public health and the public health, safety, and welfare, that phrase from our Constitution, which explains why we adopt laws. We adopt such laws as necessary to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And there was nothing safe or good for the public welfare about living in the smoke in the dangerous, toxic industrial city. Out of that came a lot of land development regulation. And it seemed new, the idea of segregating the land uses, pushing housing farther and farther away from those dangerous and toxic industries of the time. But more on that in a second. But that was not the idea of regulating how we build our cities was not entirely new. In fact, from colonial times up until the 1940s, we had other kinds of zoning or land development regulation. King Philip from Spain implemented a rule book called the Laws of the Indies, which applied throughout the New World. You read that, and it basically specifies the things you would expect to see in a modern comprehensive plan or land development code the size of blocks, where certain land uses should be located, where the public space will be, with the dimensions of the streets, and so on. So this is not entirely new. The idea of putting down a rule book about how we will settle our human habitats. Now, zoning as we know it today started in earnest around 1916, and where else? In Manhattan. Because as they had the elevator and steel structures and they were building taller and taller, they were beginning to crowd out the light and air, the sunlight and fresh air from getting to the street. So New York drew a map. That's the map right there in the far right, that specified how building form should change depending on where you are. And they also looked ahead at the prospect of ever taller and taller buildings, and they implemented rules to make sure that we could get that development, get all that economic progress, but also protect the public health and safety. So if you look closely at the skyline of New York, of just about every building built between 1916 and 1964, you'll see that familiar profile at the top of the Great American Skyscraper style. It came right from their rule book, which basically said that as the building goes up, after a certain point, it has to step back to allow light and air to hit the street. So the idea of identifying on a map which rules would apply to which zones really took off at that point. Now, about a decade later, the system for doing that changed a lot. It changed from organizing the code around addresses and form to addressing land uses. They reorganized the whole table of contents of the typical zoning around the idea of keeping density and intensity as low as possible and land uses as segregated as possible. Well, fast forward 100 years, and that was just a recipe for more and more driving. And in modern times, with our even our smokestack industries are heavily regulated and not the polluters they once were. We no longer can really justify this idea of pushing all the housing far away from the places where people work or they sell each other things. And that is one of the issues that has to be resolved according to the blueprints for Southwest and Ilana Prost's document and the comprehensive plan. It says we need to start allowing for residential uses, for example, in and among the places where people work to create a live-work environment. In most conventional zoning, if you just look at the table of contents, you'll see that the big priority is put on the land use. That's the activity inside the building, like commercial in your building and residential in yours and single-family residential in yours, offices or industrial in yours. And that is typically there. And then there are little rules as you start to study it that affect urban form, like how far close to the street the building is allowed to be, or how much parking you have to have. So design gets a little bit of attention, but land use gets most of the attention. Another approach is to keep land use requirements, but to simplify them, to allow for more flexibility, and to put the emphasis on design. And think back about Congdon Yards or the examples from the history books I showed you of the great old industrial buildings of the past. We actually know that it's the design that's lasting, not the temporary roster of uses that are inside the building. How do I know that's true? Well, all you have to do is look at other places which have gone through this kind of transitional industrial process that Margaret described. You could go to the Warehouse Arts District in St. Petersburg, or to the Brewer in San Leandro, California, or to the Pearl District in Portland. You know why those patios are set at the height they are in the repurposed industrial buildings? That's the old dock height loading dock, set up on the height of the truck. You can go to places like Seattle and see examples like Charles Smith Wines, where the old industrial buildings have been repurposed, and they're beautiful, and they have not swept away their history in a kind of slash and burn urban renewal program, scraping everything off and starting completely from scratch. We all know that didn't work very well. Instead, they've kept the existing buildings and built in and among them and added to them and modified what's going on inside. The Hive in Oakland, California is their answer to Cohab. I think they probably need to come study Cohab and see how well you've done it, John, and then they'll even up their game further. We can look at examples throughout the country, like in Charlotte, for example. Some of you probably know the Mill District. where they also had a collection of impressive old mill buildings. There's the before picture for the Mecklenburg Cotton Mill, and there's the after. Here's the hosiery mill, and there's the repurposed building. Here's another one. The Soul Food Meat Company, the Switchyards Neighborhood Work Club. Love this example because it shows it's not just the big buildings with the lots of stories and the giant brick walls, but the small buildings as well. More examples from Charlotte. If y'all haven't been down there to see it, I highly recommend it. You can also take a short jaunt to Greenville and see the Judson Mill, which is considered a national example as well. And look, when they turned the lights back on in their historic buildings, they allowed new things upstairs that were previously prohibited, like places to live. Not a bad idea. And back to Richmond for an example, this is called Scott's Addition. I'm hoping these examples are giving you confidence that you have the raw material here, and certainly the energy to modify these places and make them new. Margaret?
Thank you, Victor. So looking at the High Point Core City Plan and the blueprints and the comp plan, you all are very much on your way to helping with initiatives. And with the city of High Point, they have the targeted investment areas centered around 300 Oak and West Green. So some financial incentives as well. And then like we were sharing with the comp plan, we thought we'd go ahead and break it down. So this image that we think is really fantastic and was created by the planners at CZB who are working on the comp plan. We are excited that Southwest High Point in the area around 300 Oak was featured as the town center example for the entire city. And so what we thought we'd do is just sort of break it down like an X-ray of what makes this image appealing. What is it about it? So we've got some adaptive reuse of the existing building. We've got the addition of new buildings. So what's labeled A, that could be maker spaces, or B, apartments, C, gathering spaces, and D, reuse of the existing building at 300 Oak. So all of these different elements are sort of this strategic placement of new development on disturbed land. And then looking at the Heritage Greenway coming in, the addition of street trees, street-oriented buildings where doors and windows are facing streets and they're facing public spaces. So it sort of gets kind of into some of the back to basics, but I think an image like this is really telling because it's stunning. And so you really have to look at what makes that place special. So what are all those various components? When we've been looking at the land development regulations, as I mentioned earlier, with the heavy industrial and the light industrial, these are some of the things that sort of we flagged as items to consider, incorporating a greater mix of uses in the Southwest, street-oriented buildings, sort of building on that legacy of doors and windows and walkability in the area, walkable streets, continuing to support small-scale industry. And this is important because when you're looking at the land development regulations and you're looking at the existing buildings that are there, many buildings, especially like down towards Pickett Mill and some of the other areas, there's some large areas that are also used for storage as well as deliveries. And so there's things that need to continue to operate and to continue to be available and accessible, as well as looking at the Greenway. What opportunities could we use with land development regulations to support the Greenway? One thing, and I'll show this in just a minute, but one thing thinking about the Greenway is there aren't currently land development regulations supporting it. And so let's say, for instance, as the Greenway's developed, a lot of buildings are turning their backs or they're putting some not so great things in their backyards that front the Greenway, or chain link fences or different things where it's set apart from the community. So ways to protect the Greenway as public infrastructure. So those are sort of some of the key things, as well as looking at parking. There's definitely some issues with some large parking lots and parking sort of eating up some of your what could be very vibrant corridors. So these are sort of some of the things that we're going to be looking at, as well as sort of what makes up that town center as far as looking at a walkable area and the different components that could be included in updated land development regulations to help to support the built condition.
I made Margaret let me show this because these are the more exciting pictures. we did show the before and after image in the past of what this area could look like right down on Green Street. And but then we went back to talk about what should be in a new mixed-use industrial zoning district. And we had to look first at what is not just allowed, but probable under the existing zoning without any additional standards or without any additional guidance and without those extra permissions. What will tend to happen is single-use buildings set far apart. For example, you probably end up with parking lots on the corners, right where that sense of dissipated public space that resulted from all the urban removal in the past. There will be space between the buildings, but not meaningful public space. And then we'll probably end up with buildings that have few of those eyes on the street, the windows and balconies and so on, that give it natural surveillance and make it safer, but also just make it look like a place where humans live and work, not just their cars. So it's easy to pick apart an existing zoning code and say, and imagine the worst case scenario somebody might design if you don't fix it. But what would we do if we did fix it? Now, everything I'm about to show you is just a draft, just work in progress, thoughts put out here for your feedback and to enable a better discussion with staff. The first thing to realize is that scene is really an ensemble that consists of private effort on the private lots and public effort in the public right-of-way. So we drew a little white line to remind you where the property lines are and say the code provisions, that's the zoning rules, are going to apply to the private development. And then imagine what someone would do if enabled. If you could make it economically feasible for them, for example, put the parking in the back instead of in the front, to put the multiple uses and multiple revenue centers inside the building they plan to build or reuse instead of just one, and what the building mass and volume would be allowed to be. And then this idea of civic spaces, which is enshrined in the comprehensive plan and the code, that those places like maybe that all-important corner is a good one for public spaces that, again, feel like human habitat, not just parking spaces. So in addition to our street front, right on the sidewalk kind of addresses, we could also have addresses that are on a neighborhood square or plaza or four corners. Now, in design, you start thinking about not just the box, or the volume, but the way it's divided into a bottom, a middle, and a top. And those great old examples I showed you from history always had this kind of design grammar in them, in their architecture. First marking the tops of the buildings, then thinking about how to layer the facades horizontally as they go up. So that's where we start thinking about how to add transparent and openings to the walls. Here you see windows added upstairs and storefronts and windows added downstairs. I mean, think about where entrances would go. So these are things that normally might be completely left out of a zoning code that are very helpful. They're enabling for someone who wants to maximize the use of their property. And you can go on from there. Things like those encroachments and appurtenances that people add on to buildings, like the awnings, for example, or canopies that protect their storefronts from glare in the sun or from protect patrons from sudden storms. And those are the ingredients that lead to the after picture that we showed you before. Well, not quite, because this is just the private development. But we also have all that public real estate owned by local government. And so let me just do that again. Here's just building the buildings and still leaving power lines on both sides of the street and insufficient skinny sidewalks and way too much asphalt and a lot of pollution and runoff that comes from a gray version of Green Street. But what if we green Street again and add the street trees and rain gardens, get the asphalt and for driving and parking in the right amount instead of an excessive amount, and fix the design of the intersection so that as a person who's already parked, who came to the district, you might be inclined to walk from one of these places to visit to another. And so that's kind of a list of ingredients that we take into account when we're thinking about how to make a new code that's both more flexible and also more predictable. You want to be able to empower people, enable people to do things they're currently prohibited from doing. The most obvious one is adding residential to the list of mixed uses. You also want people to live to a certain quality standards in the work that they build. So it's not just safe, protecting us from the danger of say a fire or that kind of thing, but also economically robust and encourages their neighbor to implement something equally good on the property across the street. So the illustrations that we did for the blueprint were kind of a testing ground for what would be in such a rule book. Now, there's always hand-wringing and consternation when we start saying something like, windows on the ground floor of your building would be a good idea. Because that sounds like we're adding rules rather than just enabling and repealing some, right? So it will undoubtedly need to be a mix of both things. But I think it's important to realize there's a long industrial tradition, including the historic industrial structures I showed you so many pictures of, from your own history books and from the examples around the country, of allowing for transparency on the facades adjacent to industrial buildings. I love, there's a very modern example, hyper-modern example in Columbus, Indiana, where their newspaper plant is inside a glass curtain wall building. And it's all the bright yellow machines inside there that are, spinning at night and making newspapers on display for everyone going by on the outside to see. It's actually kind of miraculous. It's like they made a gallery exhibit and high art out of their industrial production. And they let everybody see it by turning on the lights inside the building and having some windows facing the street. I suppose we've said windows enough times. I'll just move on. We also know we need to do things that are pretty basic, like parking and loading and unloading in a neighborhood like this. So we need the street designs and the site plans to be flexible for just those kinds of things. I'm going to back up to the picture I showed you a moment ago, because whenever we show a picture like this with all the pretty trees and upgraded buildings, someone says, "Where's all the parking?" And so I'm zooming in just so you can see. There's actually room on these lots to do plentiful parking. It's not like you're building buildings instead of having parking. Thankfully, you don't have a ridiculous minimum parking requirement, which so many cities around the country are now having to painfully exorcise, I think is the right term, from their zoning codes. Yours is already out. That's good. But parking is a normal part of these site plans as well. It doesn't always jump out at you in the renderings unless we show it to you. Margaret?
With the renderings that we've been creating from the blueprints, we also find them very helpful tools, almost like x-rays. And so these are just sort of some of the things that we're working on as we're looking at the land development regulations for the Southwest. Just sort of looking at, as Victor was saying, the private improvements, so what land development regulations control on the private property, as well as what public improvements would look like. And so I think that these renderings are very helpful because they show an idea of a vision, but then when you really get down to the things, as we were showing, like with the town center image from the comp plan, what makes that image so appealing? What are those elements? And so we've also been doing some research from other cities, as Victor mentioned, looking at precedent photos, as well as looking at their regulations. So looking at Beltline in Atlanta, or Scott's Addition in Richmond, or the Mills in Greenville, South Carolina. So not just, they have incredible historic architecture and building stock, but how are they using their regulations to protect and encourage the revitalization and redevelopment of those areas? So just sort of looking at some of those examples as well, the Highline in New York, Farmville, Virginia, the High Bridge Trail. And Farmville is really interesting with Greenfront there, with the reuse of the mills, the tobacco warehouses, but sort of looking at the vibrancy of being on a greenway, being on a green corridor, and what that can mean for the Southwest as well.
Let's just be clear. If they can do this in Farmville, Virginia, you can do this in Highland.
You can do it. But I think that this example is very telling. So once again, looking at the rendering of what could be for the greenway, and then getting down into those details of what makes that work with doors and windows facing the street, And so treating the greenway as a primary entrance as well as the street entrance as well. And then the public improvements with implementing the greenway with the lighting and the greening and just really making this path central throughout Southwest and throughout High Point. So with all of that said, with the town center area around 300 Oak, we realize, as I was mentioning earlier, that many of the industrial uses may not create as much of a walkable environment, but yet there's still opportunities to add a mix of uses. And so this was an example at Tryon and Ennis, looking at this existing building that's there on the corner. And it's an incredible opportunity for rehabilitation. There's a church across the street, and then it looks like a corner store adjacent to it. And then there's single-family residential, as well as getting more into the industrial uses. And so this was an example to sort of show, like the 520 West Green, what would happen if you were to turn the lights back on in this building. So sort of looking at some initial renovation of the existing historic structure with the idea of getting a maker space or small scale manufacturing with a storefront there. And then in time, as redevelopment continues to happen and opportunities to get more of a mix of housing or residential in there, this was sort of influenced by what we've been seeing in Richmond, Virginia. So you have sort of the opportunity to live and work all in the same district. Oh, and this was with the continued, this would be with the public investment if the power lines were to go away, and just some different improvements to the street. So these are the types of sort of x-rays that we're looking at to understand what are the elements that could make the place more complete, and how those are translating into regulations. So I know regulations is sometimes a difficult topic, and it's a lot to process, and we're appreciative of you all hanging in there with us. But I think the main thing that we just sort of are curious, are you all ready for this next chapter in your story for Southwest High Point? Are you ready for this mix of uses and this legacy of industrial, and how to continue that? And
Let's see a show of hands. How many of you think this is on the right track and we should keep going?
Yeah.
We should do that again and get a picture of that. How many of you think this is on the right track? And we should keep going. Thank you very much.
well, once again, we're grateful to be a part of it. We're open to take any questions or hear any initial thoughts you all may have. Anyone have any questions as we... Oh, hold on one second. Next steps. I want to make sure that this is super important. So what we've been doing with the blueprints, as I said, is more of a conceptual framework leading towards, as the city has adopted area plans, so actual policy planning documents that would be adopted and approved. So as far as next steps of what we're going to be working on is taking the blueprints and transforming them into an area plan for the area along West Green. So that's what we're going to be working on. So there will be time for additional public comment for public process, and that will go through the Planning and Zoning Commission as well as City Council. If and when that is approved and move forward, that's then when those regulatory changes can start to happen. And so that's important. We are working on a draft of regulations. And so we're ready to continue to move forward once the area plan moves forward. But there is a public process. So this is sort of, I would say today, more of an information meeting to get everyone up to speed with what we've been working on with the blueprints. And then there will be that formal process coming as well. But we really wanted to gather here today at the String and Splinter and with you all to just sort of get some initial feedback and make sure that things are headed in the right direction. So thank you again for being here, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Could you talk about a little bit about the difference between town planners and town planners and designers, those type of firms? I know not all town planners also have the designer.
Sure. Well, I'll start and then you could. I would just say that in the world of city planning, there's all sorts of different elements that go along that. A lot of city planning is policy driven. So looking at your comprehensive plan and your area plans, and then you can also combine that policy planning with urban design and town planning. And so at our firm, many of us are trained as architects as well as city planners, but we add design to the policies. And so that's why what you've seen today with so many different illustrations and renderings, we really like to add the pictures with the words. So our office is a combination of urban designers and town planners. I myself am a traditional city planner. I got my start with historic preservation and then started in planning. So unfortunately, I can't draw or do all these amazing computer renderings, but I can write and I can do policy. And so there's just a lot of different elements that go into city planning. And I feel really fortunate with our firm where we're sort of looking at the holistic picture of planning. So not just words and policies, but also shaping that vision and working with communities and designing in public is what we really enjoy doing.
As I do think, well, yeah, I'm opinionated, but especially as we move towards home furnishings and design capital, we've got Carol Hill today and Jane Dagme and John and Ridvan, and I don't see Stuart anywhere. I think it's going to be very important to utilize town planners and design firms to get our public realm right, to make us look better, pay more attention to the design between our historic buildings and our existing buildings. And then we have Tag here, Jeff Horney, very creative people in town that need to be heard and be at the table with town planning, because we are the home furnishings and design really capital of the world, and we need to emphasize that and market it.
Well, thank you, Dorothy. I do think that the spaces between the buildings are crucial. And are you good? Okay.
Not a question, but as when you first started, the comp plan came to mind. I was like, I wonder how this ties together, or how this goes together. And I was encouraged to hear you talk about the work that CZB did with the steering committee, and how encouraged you are that the work that you do goes together with the comp plan and how they complement one another. So I was encouraged to hear that.
I'll share a little secret with you. There is no greater pleasure than discovering that the comprehensive plan and then the raw existing land development regulations in place are already on the right track and doing great. In our work, we work about half the time for local governments and community groups like the foundation, and about half the time for private investors and developers, not in the same place at the same time. So in another town, we'd be working for a developer, and a developer client with all the best of intentions would come into our office and say, I've got this incredible site. I would like to do the best thing we've ever built, and I'd like you to do your best work ever. But no comprehensive plan amendment, no zoning revisions, no variances, no waivers, no exceptions, no warrants, no public hearings, no process. Please, I can't do any of that again. And then we open up that town's comprehensive plan and have to come back and deliver the disappointing news. Everything you want to do and everything that would be right for this place has been prohibited by lawyers and bureaucracy. So we can't do our best work, and you can't build the best thing you've ever built unless we fix those things. But in High Point, you have a fantastic comprehensive plan, and it shows all the work that went into it. You know, those things are not birthed easily. That took a lot of meetings and a lot of reading and a lot of thinking and arguing, I'm sure, to get it that good. In many places, we'll find that they have all kinds of good sounding intentions in their policy statements, like in the front of the comprehensive plan, or even in the intent and the zoning districts. It'll talk about preserving the small town, hometown feeling and the walkable town center and so on. And then the first page is a gigantic minimum parking requirement, which is designed for Ozzie and Harriet households that don't even exist anymore. And on the assumption that we're all going to drive everywhere for everything every time alone, and have to have so much parking that there would be enough for all of that and extra for the day after Thanksgiving. But in your town, you've already fixed that problem. You've already addressed the minimum parking requirement. So I'm heaping my praise on top of yours. It's really so much more fun to work in a place where those basic things are already there. So good on you.
Yes.
Why don't you speak a little bit to commercial development design in High Point?
Well, I can't. Hi, I'm Peter Bishop, the city's director of economic development. Good afternoon. I don't know that I can speak too much to design. That's not my forte. There are many great designers in this room that I would not embarrass myself to speak on it. Looking at this plan, obviously, I think transitional industrial is the perfect phrase for talking about this property type. And I think we need to be sensitive to the existing operations in this area, some of the legacy operations, but just this is an industrial area. Industries create jobs, they create trade, they support the furniture market. They're very important to the city. And sometimes people and industry don't always mix well together. So being, attentive to that and to the design and to how you design those spaces, but also not to over-regulate it so that we don't have a cost problem. Because there's a direct relationship between cost and regulation sometimes. So it's an interesting set of balances, and it's very really amazing. I think there's some people in here that have already started the process of redevelopment in this area and have had some growing pains in some of those areas. This is also an area where market rents are somewhat lower than the other ones, so it's going to take some carrots and some investment to get private investment to come in and build up those rents a little bit. And then you have the gentrification problem. So those are good problems to have, and problems I think we can solve together through a redeveloped transitional industrial area. There is a lot of interest in these buildings for their architectural features, their character. I was just in another redeveloped, what we think would be a functionally obsolete, low ceiling, masonry building. There's a Polish company that started a manufacturing operation for furniture in there to be closer to market, to be closer to design. So we have a lot of those opportunities in those companies, and there's a lot of these great buildings here. So I'm encouraged by the plan, certainly encouraged by the comprehensive plan and the work that Sushil's staff has done to sort of unlock some of these things and make these things available. So it's just trying to lure the investment and encourage the locals who have invested in these areas, support them and their visions, so that we have a good blend of both of those things.
No. I mean, I just wanted to know the saleability of when you improve the streetscapes, when you pay attention to how your community looks, when you incorporate design into a city. I think that, personally, I think that a lot of companies, unless they just purely, just want brick walls and no windows, really are attracted to attractive places. And I think it's something our transportation system really needs to pay attention to, the public realm and the lowly street tree, as Victor says. We need shade in the South, and a tree can make the ugliest building look good. So we really need to start thinking about some of those things for our downtown area, which the Southwest is part of our downtown area. Traditionally, we're in the core city area, and that was our traditional historic downtown.
Just a final thought about regulation. We're not suggesting to deregulate everything and to throw the baby out with the bathwater there. What we are suggesting is to focus on the few things that matter the most, regulate those fairly strictly, like you mean it, with thought ahead to where there will be need for flexibility and what you do with the unique situations. But a lot of the original intent behind zoning that you saw in those pictures of industrial England and what have you, was focused on reestablishing a basic norm of public safety. And many of the buildings we have were not built today in the Southwest, were not built with public safety as the first thing on the agenda. So they may not have sprinklers. They may not have two means of egress that are, safe in the case of a fire. So there are a few things that you just, because of the building code, not the zoning code, are just going to have to do. I mean, and these are expensive things, Peter, that as you were talking about cost, I was thinking there's so much that a property owner has to do to satisfy those basic life safety requirements, pollution control, fire safety, to name a couple, before you even get to the zoning. The zoning is a chance to affect other things, like the site plan, for example, so that we create the walkable environment, but we also minimize the problem of non-point source runoff pollution, running into the creek, just as an example. Those are things that are not going to come easily from the building code, but they do come from the land development regulations. So those will also affect how somebody lays out their site. And they will mean that in order to show that you're doing it right and not wrong, you're going to have to invest in a drawing. You have to do design and draw the site plan. And so some of the things that owners will probably encounter as they start to rush to reoccupy existing buildings is they're going to run into a little bit of the need to go from cubicle to cubicle in the bureaucracy and get those things checked as they go. That's just the normal part of doing business. And none of us would want to give that up. You know, we have some basic norms we expect, like accessibility, for example, that are part of our culture. It wouldn't be American to not make the place accessible to everyone. So those are going to, those rules don't go anywhere as a result of adjusting the zoning. So it means that it's not going to be easy for any given property owner to just walk in one door and walk out the same door with a permit an hour later. That we're not going to get to that because they're going to need to invest in the drawings, and they're going to put those things on the counter in front of the city staff, whose job is to make sure that doesn't burn down around them or hurt their neighbors. So those are, I know that sounds all kind of dire, but I guess what I'm trying to do is temper the enthusiasm for liberalizing the land uses and reducing the parking requirements or eliminating them, thank goodness, and adding street trees and so on. There are still basics that we expect in every building project. Monica?
Sorry, and I hate to speak, but I want to just do this real quick. So I just want to kind of clarify some intentions real quick. First of all, our planning staff has done an amazing job on our Comp Plan 2045. They really have. And Dover Cole and Margaret's bragged to me about how great the staff has been to work with. So thank you guys so much. So Dorothy Dar was able to write a grant, because those comprehensive plans, rezoning takes time. And, we've all kind of known that this heavy industrial area we knew did not need to be heavy industrial. Well, thankfully, Dorothy Dar wrote a grant to get Dover Cole to come in and to just like laser focus on this area so that we can make changes quicker. So that these investors that are investing now, before the greenways coming in, can start building, and we can have the kind of investments that we know will foster the success of the greenway. So we are so thankful to you, Dorothy, for writing that grant.
North Carolina Regional Economic Development.
Okay, and so incredibly grateful for the work of Dover Cole. But I just wanted to let y'all know that we're super grateful to our staff that did an amazing job on that comprehensive plan 2045, and this works perfectly with it. So,
Monica, do you want to close out, because we want to respect everybody's time, and it's a little bit.
Benediction.
That's the benediction. Well, thank you so much to Margaret Flippen and Victor Dover, and all of you for coming. Let's give ourselves a big round of applause. Thank you so much. And I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.